views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
On this edition of Today's Verdict, we continue to bring you everything you need to know about the coronavirus and your legal rights as we once again come to you from my home. Our first guest, Assemblymember Karines Reyes, will discuss the resources available for our undocumented immigrants, as many have concerns during the pandemic. Many of the undocumented are highly represented in the essential workforce, making them at a higher risk for exposure to COVID-19. Next up, State Senator Julia Salazar has introduced a relief for all emergency bill. It addresses the economic hardship on New York tenants, homeowners, small businesses, and others caused by the COVID-19 public emergency. The state senator will give us some of the details. And finally, Bernadette Jentsch, an attorney with Mobilization for Justice, will help us understand the Workplace Justice Project and how unemployment insurance has been impacted during the crisis. As you can see, we have much to get to, so stay tuned. Today's verdict starts right now. Here with Assemblymember Karines Reyes. First and foremost, how are you doing? How are you feeling?
I'm well, I'm healthy, and to me, that's a blessing. So I can't complain.
I think we have a little bit more of this. I don't know how much, but certainly things are moving fairly quickly. Let's talk a little bit about the immigrants in our city. Documented versus non-documented. How are they faring with respect to the pandemic?
Look, I think that our immigrant population was struggling before, and even more so now. This is unfortunately a population that in many ways lived in the shadows. And when we talk about social distancing and what that looks like, many of our immigrants live in crowded living conditions. We have a lot of immigrants that don't have their own apartment. They rent a room and they have multiple roommates. And of course, that makes social distancing impossible. And also, we have a lot of our immigrant families that have multi-generational households, which means that there are, again, crowded living conditions. A lot of people living in a home, some of the age that puts them at higher risk for really negative COVID outcomes. Unemployment has been an issue as well, and being able to access unemployment insurance for our immigrant population, language access, all those things have made it more difficult for the immigrant population in the Bronx to deal with what's been happening in our city.
Does it seem that many of the immigrants are on the front lines, that they are essential workers, that they are more prone to be exposed from your experience?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of our immigrant workers and undocumented workers are in during this time considered essential. Many of them work in food service or cleaning. Many immigrants work in healthcare and different capacities, and are now considered essential when many of our immigrant workers were never considered essential. And that means that they can't stay home and that they are out there taking the trains, working all kinds of hours, exposing themselves to the public and potentially exposing themselves and their families to being infected. And we've seen that in the numbers of infection rates, in not just in the Bronx, but in dense immigrant communities throughout the city.
Which leads to infection for themselves, which leads to going to hospitals. Are they afraid to go? Some are not documented. What's the take there?
Yeah, I think that, and this is a given, if you are undocumented, you are uninsured, and you're going to fear going to the hospital because you're afraid of being asked of your immigration status or your documentation status, and you're afraid of potentially not being able to pay for your medical care. But that's across the board, not just for undocumented immigrants, but for uninsured people in our city who have chosen not to seek medical treatment during this time because they are afraid that they can't pay for it. And I think moving forward, it's important that we continue to have the conversation of what access for all looks like in New York State. We should be expanding healthcare to everyone as a human right. It should not be a privilege, regardless of employment status, income status, immigration status, documentation status. I think everybody should have access to healthcare. It's the humane thing to do.
You know, sometimes it takes something like this to happen to awaken the population as to what's really important. Are you getting a sense from either your constituents or just from the basic community that they would like a forever change in the healthcare system because of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have always been a champion for a single payer healthcare system in New York and expanding access to everyone. But even those people that I think were naysayers or were on the fence about it really see the value in making sure that every person, every human life in our communities has access to healthcare. Because the reality is that this is all one big link. And when there is a weak link, it affects all of us. And we should be making sure that every person in our communities is strong and healthy.
Very important piece of legislation, the New York for All Act. Can you tell the viewers a little bit about it? I find it very interesting.
Yes. So the New York for All Act strives to make New York State a sanctuary state. And what that really means is that, particularly in a time like this, where we have huge budget deficits, that we're not using state resources to fulfill an ICE mandate by the federal government, that we're not using our resources to attack and track down and put fear in our immigrant population. They should not be afraid to come forth and either talk to law enforcement or seek medical care or seek social services at a time like this because they're afraid of being asked of their documentation status. We want to make sure a sanctuary state means that no public agency can ask you or share your documentation status with the federal government. We want to make sure that people are not afraid, regardless of whether they're documented or undocumented, to come forth at a time like this and seek services if they need it, seek help if they need it. And I think that's important to make sure that we make our city and our state safer.
And once again, you know, because of the pandemic, does it look like this will have some traction? In other words, do you think people can get behind this? You know, listen, a lot of these workers who are doing these things, you know, the undocumented or the immigrants, they're providing services to many people who are just able to stay home, and it's really not particularly fair. Does it look like the tide may turn and they may get more sympathy from the general population with respect to sanctuary cities?
Yeah, I think people are realizing that the people that they didn't think were essential before are absolutely essential. And like you said, these are the individuals that are delivering our foods, are keeping our food chain alive and well, and keeping our grocery stores shelves stocked. And I think it's important, and people are really seeing that. Particularly when you're sitting at home and you're from the comfort of your home, you realize that there are people out there risking their lives, not necessarily by choice, but because they have to survive.
And you know, a lot of people have fled this city and they've gone to their homes and other places. And for the rest of us who are still here or still in the city, who, you know, rely on these services, well, they don't just come out of it from nowhere. They come from people who are risking themselves every day delivering foods and doing these types of services. Doormen, everybody who comes here to do those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Final advice. Somebody's watching, undocumented, documented. What would you tell them about what's been going on? What advice would you give them if you could?
I would say to them to not be afraid to come forth, particularly to elected officials. My office is willing to help anybody or guide anybody or point anybody in the right direction, whether they're documented or undocumented. If they are a resident in our district and a resident of our city and they need help of any kind, we're willing to do that. So they shouldn't be afraid to come forth to their elected officials if they have any trouble or any questions pertaining to either immigration or unemployment or even finding resources food banks, open food banks in the community, places where they can get help either with childcare because they're essential workers. All of that will be willing to help, so they should be not afraid to come forth.
Perfect. All right, Assemblymember Karines Reyes, it's a pleasure finally getting to meet you. Hopefully next time it'll be in studio. And the most important thing, please stay safe.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be back with more Today's Verdict after this. We're here with State Senator Julia Salazar. Senator, first of all, thanks for being here. How are you feeling? How have things been?
Personally, I am feeling good. I feel very lucky that I haven't really been impacted personally by this crisis. But all things considered, it's a very challenging time for our district right now.
All right. Well, let's get right to it. It's a mouthful, but let's talk about the Emergency Coronavirus Affordable Housing Preservation Act, which you are firmly in support of and introduced. Let's talk a little bit about that, if you could.
Sure. We've been calling it because it's a long name. We've been referring to it as the Relief for All bill, and that really indicates the intent of the bill. It's intended to be a comprehensive bill that offers a solution that doesn't leave out homeowners or small business owners who are struggling, or even the non-for-profit affordable housing providers, many of which are in my district and, of course, all over the city, and have been struggling and are anticipating being hit financially even after we defeat this pandemic. The other legislation that had been introduced before this to essentially cancel rent, to suspend rent payments and mortgage payments for people who could demonstrate that they have lost income due to COVID-19. It didn't address the needs of small homeowners, right? It didn't address the question of, well, what happens? Of course, there are many tenants who already have been unable to pay their rent. What happens after the eviction moratorium ends? What happens for the small homeowners who rely on the rent from their tenants in order to pay their mortgage? And the intent of the Relief for All bill is to provide a solution for all parties that are affected with regard to housing. It ensures that rents would be suspended for tenants who have lost income, and there is not a significant burden for them to demonstrate that they've lost income, which is really important right now, both because there are so many people hurting, and it is demanding so much capacity from agencies and from elected officials' offices to process their claims. It's really important that it takes a minimal process in order for people to be eligible and to demonstrate that they have lost income due to the crisis. But furthermore, in cases where rent is suspended for tenants, there would be proportionate relief for the homeowners in those cases, as well as for affordable housing providers whose tenants are unable to pay their rent. And then additionally, and very importantly, the commercial tenants, mostly small business owners who are struggling right now, necessarily closed their businesses for the sake of public health, or who have just lost most of their business due to the crisis, that they will still be able to survive after the dust settles. So that's really what the bill is about, and I introduced it in the Senate along with Assemblyman Lenthal in the Assembly.
So let me ask you a question: is there like a schedule in terms of how much somebody would be getting back in terms of rent, or to be able to assist them, whether it's residential or it's commercial? How do you figure out the specifics for each particular homeowner, let's say?
Right. Well, in the case of this bill, there is not just partial forgiveness. If somebody can demonstrate that they've lost income, then their rent payment and likewise their mortgage payment would be suspended. And what that means is that, of course, in turn, we're going to need to rely on the hopefully additional federal stimulus funds in order to close the loop and make sure that the relief is actually provided to, say, mortgage servicers, to banks that service, or rather that issue these mortgages to homeowners. But we really believe that it's important that we provide this relief immediately to the people who are not going to be able to afford to take the hit and whose homes will be in jeopardy, facing foreclosure or facing eviction, if we don't act immediately to provide that relief to them.
You know, I also see it as in conjunction with that rent freeze bill as well. In other words, everything we're possibly doing to hopefully lessen the burden for any of the tenants throughout the city. How does that relate in terms of this bill?
Right. So all of the rent regulated tenants throughout New York City, and even outside the city in areas where like Westchester and Long Island, or parts of Long Island where there's a rent guidelines board that regulates rent. I introduced a bill with Assemblyman Harvey Epstein to demand a rent freeze on those rent regulated units, so that for tenants whose leases will expire within the next year at some point, whether in the next month or anytime within the next year, that upon lease renewal, their landlord would not be able to raise the rent, that their rent would remain frozen. This is really important because naturally, in addition to people really needing rent forgiveness and rent relief, it's a very difficult time for people to have to accommodate additional expenses, right? And have to plan to pay even more rent than they already are. We've seen the Rent Guidelines Board in New York City essentially implement a rent freeze before, in which they did not grant a rent increase at all to rent regulated buildings. And so it's not unprecedented. And I think that it's really what tenants, rent regulated tenants, are going to need at minimum in order to survive this.
For every yin there's a yang. Is there a pushback by some of the landlords that you've been hearing about with respect to, they have to pay their own property state taxes, obviously they have to pay utilities? What are you hearing on their end?
That's exactly what we're hearing is the concerns that property owners have, and it's why it's so important for us to have a closed loop solution that addresses their needs as well. At least for those who anticipate losing income or can demonstrate that they really rely on revenue from rent payments, for example, in order to cover their costs. And so that's really where the federal funds, any funds that currently exist at the state level that are emergency funds, need to be allocated for this purpose. I haven't seen pushback yet against the proposal for a rent freeze, and I think that is probably because the Rent Guidelines Board, even though we haven't passed this legislation, the Rent Guidelines Board is already considering a rent freeze, because I think people know what time it is. They see the urgency for this.
Well, Senator, the Emergency Coronavirus Affordable Housing Preservation Act, very important, really great stuff. Hopefully the next time we see you, Senator, it'll actually be in studio, hopefully.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I hope you all stay safe and healthy, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about the bill.
Absolutely, it's our pleasure. All right, we'll be back with more Today's Verdict right after this. We're here with Bernadette Jentsch, a senior staff attorney with Mobilization Justice. Bernadette, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, first and foremost, how are you feeling? How's the family? How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for asking. Hope yours is all right as well.
Yeah, well, we're hoping at some point this starts to calm down a little bit, but things seem to be moving fairly quickly. Some things faster for others. I'm going to talk a little bit about benefits that people are not getting that they should be getting. But let's start off with the Workplace Justice Project. Let's talk a little bit about it. Can you tell the viewers what that project is, if you could?
Sure. So the Workplace Justice Project is one of many projects at Mobilization for Justice, formerly MFY Legal Services. It's a nonprofit civil legal service provider. Our project specifically provides legal assistance to low-wage and immigrant workers with employment issues.
Now, during this particular time, unemployment seems to be the big topic of discussion. People are applying for benefits that had never in their lives applied before. And from what I hear, it's like calling in, to a radio station and hopefully being the one caller that gets the free tickets. What have you heard about the ability to get unemployment benefits?
Yes, that is very true. There has been a lot of difficulty, technical and otherwise, in actually just getting through the line or maybe going online and the system crashing. The system is not designed to have this many people applying. So there are those realities and difficulties in just trying to get through. But we have heard from folks that have gone through and, they've been following up in the last couple of months. It's gotten a little better. I think the Department of Labor did hire personnel to follow up with the calls and, follow up with people online if they can't get through. But again, the cell phone lines are limited. So like you said, you could be the one caller that got through and, unfortunately that's the reality. So
let's back it up a little bit for somebody who doesn't even know whether they're eligible to apply. Who is eligible? Who's not eligible? Furlough, not furlough? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So let me just maybe back up a little bit and explaining what unemployment insurance is. So regular unemployment insurance benefits in New York State is temporary income for eligible workers who have lost their job through no fault of their own, have worked enough wages in covered employment, and they must be actively looking for work during each week that they certify for benefits, and must also be willing, ready, and able to work. So traditionally, the workers who lay off, people who would be laid off would qualify. People who have been furloughed, again, losing their job because of the economic situation, that's usually, traditionally, they would qualify for the most part. So that's regular unemployment insurance folks. The federal government, under the CARES Act, authorized 3 different programs funded by the federal government that opened up for people who traditionally don't get unemployment insurance. So one is the pandemic unemployment assistance for those who, what's known as freelancers or gig workers. Traditionally, they wouldn't be eligible for unemployment insurance. There's also some self-employed independent contractors, and a group of people who are affected by COVID. So that is a big category that is now applying. The New York State Department of Labor administers the benefits. So it has to go through the same system where the regularly unemployed folks normally apply. And so as you can imagine, the system is overwhelmed by everybody funneling through the New York State Department of Labor.
Let me ask you a question about the furloughed employees. We understand that if the employer takes the loan, you're expected to return to work. And if you don't return to work when the employer is able to open up shop, your unemployment benefits could very well cease. How does that work? Because I think a lot of people are a little nervous about going back to work when they don't feel comfortable going back to work. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So let's just, play out a scenario. So let's say right now you're getting unemployment insurance and you get a call from your employer saying, hey, we're returning to work. You want to understand, is it the same set of circumstances? Are you paying the same wage, same schedule, or is it a reduced rate or a reduced schedule? So you want to understand what it is that you're going back to right? And who knows how long, they can actually sustain that. So if everything is the same and you don't have an issue returning, right, then you have make a decision whether you're going back or not, right? So one category of folks maybe won't have a problem with that, and that's all good, right? That means then you don't continue certifying if you're going back to work, on the given week. Usually, let me back up a little bit. The certification process happens at the end of the given week. So Monday to Sunday is usually when you certify on Sunday, the look back is the week before. So let's say you're getting called the following week, then you wouldn't certify if you're completely back to work. A couple of things. If, let's say, going back to work means it's only a couple of days or less than full time than what you normally usually do, right? There's partial unemployment insurance benefits that, again, depending on the situation, partial unemployment benefits can still be available for those who work less than 4 days a week and if they earn less than $504 per week. Okay, so you could still be eligible. Okay. One thing about the partial unemployment, if, let's say, the schedule that you have, if you work 4 days a week and still making less than $504 on that particular given week, you're not going to be eligible for unemployment. Okay, so usually, if at all possible, if it's reduced hours that you're being allowed to go back to work, you want to try and put the schedule so that you work Monday, Tuesday, so you don't completely lose all partial unemployment insurance benefits because for each day that you work, 25%, you lose 25% of the unemployment insurance benefits. So if you work 4 days for 1 hour for somebody, you're not going to get unemployment insurance, the partial one. So it's good to actually, if you're going to work 1 hour, 1 hour, 1 hour, 4 different days, you might as well do 1 day, 4 hours, so you can at least get for the next 3 days.
Sure, that makes sense. Right. So somebody's watching now and they haven't applied yet, or they weren't sure whether they could apply, or they haven't been able to get through. What advice would you give them? Someone's watching right now. They think they're not sure. They think they're entitled to it. They don't know if it's partial, if they don't know if it's full. What do they do? Where do they go? Do they reach out to you? What can they do?
Sure. So a couple of things. If you have access to online, if you go to the New York State Department of Labor, they've actually reconfigured a lot of that website. So it's a little easier to use. There's a lot of information about basic requirements, eligibility requirements. The online application is actually on there. You have to set up an account to be able to do the online stuff. In terms of how much am I going to get anything? There's a whole formula about how that's calculated. There's actually a benefits calculator that you can estimate. You can plug in the look back period is actually 5 calendar quarters. Okay, it's either the first 4 of the last 5 calendar quarters or the last 4 of the most recent calendar quarters, excluding the quarter that you're actually applying in. And you can plug in numbers to have an estimate. Obviously, that's an estimate. That's the first thing. When you actually get through, the Department of Labor sends you a monetary benefit determination, calculating that based on the information that they have, whether through wage reporting, through your employer. If you're one of those that maybe gets a 1099, they might not have that information, but through the application process, they might be able to calculate an estimate of the benefits.
All right. Well, that's a lot, and great advice. Really great advice for everyone, Bernadette. Hopefully the next time we see you, it'll be in studio. I can meet you in person. Okay. But most importantly, please stay safe and sound. Okay? All right. Thanks again.
Okay.
All right. We'll be back with more Today's Verdict right after this. All right. Well, that's all for our show today. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us, and of course, you, the viewers, for watching. If you have any questions about today's show, or would like to see a future topic discussed, please email me at davidlesch@bronxnet.org. From all of us at Today's Verdict, always remember, know your issues, learn the law, reach a verdict with us. We'll see you next time.